Welcome to Who Runs This Park, a podcast where you are invited into the hearts and stories of those who have committed their careers to the protection and preservation of our great national parks. Who Runs This Park aims to be a catalyst for inspiration, highlighting all that goes into managing our national parks and building a sense of appreciation for the invaluable beauty, diversity, and history of our protected lands. Today we have Andrea Compton with us, Superintendent of Great Sand Dunes National Park and Preserve. Great Sand Dunes, located in southern Colorado, is home to the tallest dunes in North America, towering over 750 feet high, set against the striking Sangre de Cristo Mountains. The park spans over 149,000 acres and encompasses not just the massive dunes, but also diverse ecosystems, including wetlands, forests, alpine lakes, and tundra. Andrea became superintendent in 2023, bringing with her a wealth of experience from across the Park Service. She previously served as superintendent at Cabrillo National Monument, acting superintendent at Joshua Tree National Park, and chief of resources at both Cabrillo and Joshua Tree. Before joining the Park Service, Andrea worked in academia and environmental consulting, leveraging her master's degree in fishery and wildlife biology from Colorado State University and her bachelor's in animal ecology from Iowa State University. I'm excited to hear her story today and heart for the mission of the National Park Service. Andrea, welcome to Who Runs This Park?
Hi, Maddie. Thank you for the invitation. I'm glad to be able to do this. You have quite a good collection of speaking with parks and superintendents. So I'm glad I can join that club. So thank you
Yeah,
for the invitation.
yeah, it's a very exclusive club. I am kidding, but we are excited to talk with you and appreciate your time. A way that people who have listened to this podcast before know I like to start off interviews is by understanding a memorable experience that each superintendent has had at their respective park. So, Andrea, I'd love to understand a memorable experience you've had as Great Sand Dunes National Park and Preserve superintendent.
Good. Thank you. Okay. And so here was my struggle. I actually had two. So can I give two?
Yeah, we've got
Okay,
time.
great. Okay, great. Okay, the first one actually I think highlights the special aspects of partnerships as are such a key part of not only Great Sand Dunes, but national parks site units everywhere. And this actually relates to search and rescue. So there
Okay.
was a while ago, there was a report of someone who got lost in the dune field. And we called in search and rescue teams, dog teams. It's not unusual that we partner with county or neighboring search and rescue groups. The dogs and handlers that came in relayed back to us after the search was over that they needed more experience, specifically on dunes. The winds churn around, the scents, they blow in odd directions. So it was much harder for the dogs to track because those
Mhm.
particles are just constantly moving. So they asked us for an opportunity to train at the park. So each fall, one weekend, search and rescue dog teams and their handlers gather here at the park to practice. And they need subjects. So I have volunteered to be a subject. I like
Oh, wow.
dogs. Yep.
Yeah.
And so I and other volunteers go out on the dunes and wait to be found. And we work with each dog separately. So we'll talk to the handler before and say, is this a new dog? How do you want us to react? So, like the young dogs, as soon as they are less experienced dogs, as soon as they find you, we have to get all excited and there's a
Oh,
toy to play with. And so it's and the more experienced ones, they give us guidance of the dog should come and sit by you and bark and then give a reward, or this dog should run back to its handler and
yeah.
needs to guide us to it. So it's a very for me, it's a rewarding experience because you get to see the dog and the person work together and think about how that might help people who need assistance in the future better. And so
Yeah. That's
that is
amazing.
that's a fun thing, right? And I often don't have much time to just go sit in the dunes and look around and enjoy the park. So
Yeah.
so that's one. And then the other relates to inspiration. So national park sites are such draw so much inspiration from artists, from painters, photographers, And we just had an opportunity this past Sunday that art extended into music. So the park was approached by a composer, Stephen Lias, and he worked with us and put together a composition about Great Sand Dunes National Park and Preserve. And it was called Wind, Water, and Sand. And the
Mm,
Boulder Philharmonic had a world premiere of that on Sunday. So
wow.
yeah, so I went up to that. So that was a very fun event. A lot of interaction with the public and hearing their stories of, okay, what did you think about it? Like talking with people at intermission. How did that resonate with you? So that was another really fun thing. So those are two.
That's cool.
Yeah, it was cool. Yep.
Did you say that this musical performance was at the park itself or it was in Boulder?
The music was performed in Boulder with a professional symphony. So
That's
it was the
amazing.
yeah, so I drove over to Boulder from the park and listened to that concert. So,
It makes
it
me
was
think of Mammoth Cave National Park did this, what is it called? Symphony orchestra in the caves. And so it was a
oh,
similar thing, but they like it was a ticketed it was a permitted event because so many people were interested. So they had to do kind of a lottery for permits to give
yeah,
away. But yeah, it was like a live concert within the actual caves in Mammoth Cave, which is it's just cool to hear these ways that the national parks interact with art and music and
yeah.
stuff like that. So I love to hear that.
Yeah, it really is. I was part of a pre-concert talk that was with the conductor of the symphony and the composer, Stephen Lias. And at one point, I asked the audience, how many of you have been to Great Sand Dunes? And a big chunk of them had. So
Mhm.
I don't know, they were probably symphony members anyway and came to attend, or maybe this was a particular draw. Of course, there was other couple pieces in the concert, it wasn't just that one, but it's great to hear people's connection and passion to parks in so many different ways.
Yeah, going back to the dog handlers and the dog teams really quick. We haven't talked on the podcast a ton about search and rescue before, but I actually hadn't heard of dog teams and handlers. I knew they existed, but haven't really talked about them yet. So what does that
Yeah,
mean? Is it usually one dog and a handler? And then could you
mhm.
kind of share, I guess, the strategy of if you end up calling search and rescue within your park, is it always going to be dog teams, stuff like that?
Yeah, sure. So it varies quite a bit, and part of it is availability of the dogs.
Right.
Let's do in Colorado, most counties have a search and rescue team, group of volunteers that are affiliated with the sheriff's department. So if
Okay.
we have a missing person, maybe we hear from a family member, somebody hasn't reported in, or in some cases, someone will do with their remote equipment. There are people often in remote areas carry satellite uh,
Oh, they'll send an SOS when they're
outreach.
like
Yeah,
Garmin inReach or something.
that's right, exactly. And so that will initiate, and it depends on how far they in. The park itself, some of our law enforcement staff are trained in search and rescue as well. So they will take the lead with it, and then these county groups will come in. So largely it's just people based. But
Right.
in certain scenarios or certain situations, you may ask for a dog and a handler.
Mhm.
So, for example, not at the park, but south of the park, there was a person who was missing, and they called in the dog team. So there is a dog and a handler
Right.
nearby, and it was cool at night. They wanted to try to find that person as quickly as possible.
Right.
Uh, so they came and looked. They did not find her that night, but the next day they had helicopters looking and they came in. It was kind of a complex situation with a lot of valleys and narrow.
Mm,
So yes, so a handler and a dog work together. And the dog and the handler can work together there's different ways dogs are trained. So some of
Right.
them are by scent, some of them are by kind of visual tracking, where the
Oh,
handler and the
interesting.
dog work together on looking at tracks, and I'm not an expert, so
Yeah.
these are just my observations.
Yeah.
A handler and a dog kinda working together, looking at that. And then there is I don't know if they call them cadaver dogs, but basically they're looking for human remains. So that
Oh, I
is
see.
the kind of scenario of worst case situations
Yeah. Yeah.
um, where you so it's a different thing, for example, it was fun, they train here as well with when they come in and do the training, and
Yeah.
so it's a different technique, right? Like, if you're working with human remains, you don't want the dog to dig or so they have to do different behaviors if they s
Yeah.
and that's usually scent, so they have different behaviors they have to do, they have to sit and bark depending on the dog.
Yeah.
So, it's an interesting process watching
Yeah.
and learning and watching people build their rapport with their dog and how do they become a more effective team working together.
Yeah, that's so cool, and I thought it was interesting what you were saying of as they're maybe training dogs. Like, at first, the dog just needs to be excited that they found you during the training
Yeah,
session, but once it becomes more experienced, it's like they're stationed by the person that they found and are barking to notify their location.
that's right.
And I also think it's cool and something I didn't think about that the sand dune environment and because from my research, these sand dunes are shaped by the wind, that it must be a very windy area. And so that messes up the scent and everything like that. So I just really
Yeah.
thought that was fascinating.
Yeah, and in fact, on, really windy days, when you look up at the dunes and you see the sand be moving around, of course, there's the kinda rooster tails at the top. As
Right.
you come off the top of the dunes, right, the sand spreads out. But if you look at smaller valleys, you see sand just swirling in so many different directions, right? It's not
Wow.
even all parallel or doing the same thing. There'll be one valley's blowing to the north, another one's blowing to the south, and another one's spinning around. And so it's just a fascinating, but yes, it's pretty complex for dogs to especially scent dogs, right, to have to try
Right.
to track that.
Do you ever have to close the park from high winds and there being like a risk of like, I don't know, like sand getting in people's eye? Like, is that just a part of being in the park or?
It is. It's just a part of being in the park, and it's part of that experience. So there's
Yeah.
a certain part of visiting any outdoor space, there is an inherent risk that
Hmm.
people take on. We often say we can't put up enough signs to warn everybody of everything.
Right.
Um, so you do like if it's really windy, it's not that pleasant, frankly, right? Because like you said, you get sand in your eyes and your mouth, and so but it's still a fascinating environment kinda watching that happen and watching that
Yeah.
form. We had some researchers, international researchers who came, and they were studying the formation of dunes and how
Wow.
dunes form. So they were starting in there's a flat creek at the base of the dunes called Medno Creek. Much of the year, the level of Medno Creek is subsurface, so you kinda have this big flat area, and they were studying at a kind of a micro scale, how do mini dunes form as the wind blows across that a relatively flat surface, and it's not flat, flat, right? It's kinda micro dunes on a very tiny scale. The creek bed's not flat, flat, but so, yeah.
Interesting. Before we dig more into Great Sand Dunes, I want to jump back just to give people context of how you even started working in the Park Service in the first place. And then we'll kind of work our way to understand some of the unique features of Great Sand Dunes. But I
Sure.
guess what you had mentioned in an interview that you entered the Park Service later in your career. So can you share about the work you did before that and then what led you to transition into the Park Service?
Sure, sure, and you gave a good introduction for track of my career a bit. So I am not one of those people who started with the Park Service as a seasonal and moved around to a bunch of parks. So after graduate school, I actually started work in the Pacific Northwest, working in environmental consulting. So I worked with a lot of surveying for species under
Hmm.
the Endangered Species Act, under the Environmental Policy Act. So doing like spotted owl surveys and then doing habitat assessments and then doing the documentations under that regulatory guidelines. And then some point, my, spouse, so it's spouse related, got a job in San Diego, California. So we moved down there, and I was trying to figure out what was coming next. What
Yeah.
does the next aspect of my career look like? And I did quite a bit of work there in academia. I taught biology at a local community college. I worked with some field station programs. So these are reserves. These are generally lands that are affiliated with the university that are used for teaching, education, research opportunities. So kind of coordinating the use of those lands.
Right.
And then I also started volunteering for the National Park Service.
Oh,
So there's a unit there, Cabrillo National Monument, and that was when I first learned that the Park Service hires what I call ologists,
oh,
biologists,
yes.
geologists, archaeologists, a whole aspect of scientists that the general visitor does not see, right? These
Yeah.
are the people that are working in the background. They are gaining an understanding of the resources, the environment of the park in order to manage it in the long term.
Right.
So I was working quite a bit with bird surveys, vegetation surveys, tide pool surveys. And I thought that the manager of natural resources, what we call the chief, had the best job. That it was very, I was just so excited about what she was doing.
Yeah.
And the main reason is that that work with the kind of guided by the Organic Act of the National Park Service mirrors my personal goals. So
Yeah.
when, I look at my personal goals of conservation of lands is one corner of the triangle. Another is kind of understanding those the environment. So
Right.
research, studying, reading, learning. And then the third is relaying that to the public.
Hmm.
So, whether you're a teacher, whether you're in interpretation, those are personal values of mine.
Hmm.
And that is very close to the Organic Act that looks at conserving resources, natural and cultural, for this and future generations. So it's not just
Yeah.
now, but it's into the future as well. So that's really, and then when that person, left for a position in the Park Service,
Hmm.
that was my entry into the Park Service, was an application there, and that's how I started as Chief of Natural Resources at Cabrillo National Monument. And
That's
then
amazing.
yeah, so then, as you said, after a while, applied for a position at and was accepted at Joshua Tree National Park,
Hmm.
for natural and cultural resource management. And then when the position opened up at Cabrillo for superintendent, I thought, well, I'll give that a try.
Yeah. Why not?
Well, yeah, see what happens.
That's
um,
awesome.
and that was the start into a superintendent for
Superintendents.
me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Did you end up moving to 29 Palms or can you commute from San Diego?
No, we
Okay.
moved to 29 Palms. It's about a 3 or 4-hour drive, so it's
Oh,
not,
okay.
yeah, it's a good distance, so it's not
Okay.
really, yeah. So, yes,
Commutable.
we moved there, so got to live in the, desert environment for a while,
Yeah.
from coastal California into the high desert, high Mojave Desert, which is another fascinating ecosystem.
Yeah. I guess as you've kind of transitioned different roles within the Park Service, what about working in the Park Service has kept you around? Like, I guess, what do you like about it? You maybe alluded to it a little bit of aligning with your personal goals.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's a big part of it, is that
Yeah.
kind of triangle of personal goals aligns well with Park Service
Hmm.
overarching goals. I would say one aspect, and then the vast majority of people that I work with enjoy working for the Park Service as well,
Yeah.
right? They are interested in that organic act in that mission in serving people, in protecting and conserving the parks where they work.
Yeah.
So it's a shared values,
Yeah, that's cool.
with the people I work with. And plus, when you visit a national park, everybody's just happy. Most people
Yeah.
are happy. But
Yeah.
so it's people are on vacation, right? They're
Yeah.
expecting fun, to do something fun and learn something new. So it's a good audience, a good positive audience to work.
Yeah, I haven't thought about that before. I like that. You had mentioned that you do a lot of or you did a lot of surveys both in the environmental consulting world and then even transitioning into the park service. What does it mean to do like a bird survey, an owl survey, a tadpole survey? Are you going out in the field or is it more like models and stuff like that?
Used to go in the field,
Yeah.
and our resources staff still do that. So there's
Okay.
kind of 2 aspects of it, and there's actually teams of people that are in this category, and it's called inventory and monitoring.
Hmm.
So the inventory is that initial assessment of what do you have. So,
Hmm.
Christmas bird counts, for example, are inventories. They're kind of what's showing up. What, if you do a small mammal survey, what small
Hmm.
animals are there? The
Yeah.
monitoring part is where you set up pretty stringent protocols for repeat visits to understand how your animals or plants are changing. So,
Mm.
how does that change over time? So, this is a long term project in most national park sites where they are looking at pika. How does our pika population change over time?
Right.
How, especially with questions about climate change. So, are they staying the same? Is it moving? What's their habitat look like? The same with birds. Usually birds, they break in for monitoring, they break into more narrow fields. You're looking at songbirds, you're looking at migrating birds, you're looking at
Right.
shorebirds.
Right.
So you get it make them more narrow. So that does entail, yes, a more detailed protocol. So then even if you do your survey once every 10 years, once every 5 years, you can have a pretty high rotation of people, but you have to have the same protocols in place to make
Right.
sure you're doing the same things and you can compare the data
Yeah.
accurately over time.
Yeah. It's taking me back to my high school math and science days of like data collection and stuff like that.
Yeah, there you go.
Obviously, I'm assuming it's much more complicated than that, but then it's just making me think of like collecting data over set
Yeah.
time frames and being able to compare
Yeah.
and stuff like that.
Yeah. Well, but computer and modeling do come in as well, right?
Yeah,
As we over time, how are you looking at a range, how do ranges of animals or plants change? Where, is, kind of like if you're looking at glaciers, right? The
right.
movement of glaciers, right? You're looking
Yeah.
at how that line changes over.
Yeah. Or I know a lot of parks are doing modeling to try and understand potential impacts of climate change and how it'll affect different things within their parks.
That's right. That's right. Right.
Jumping into you worked at Cabrillo National Monument. Can you share a little bit more about this site's history?
Yeah. So, Cabrillo National Monument, it is, right now there's 433 units in the National Park Service
Yeah.
system. And I really think these sites collectively tell such an amazing story of who we are as a nation.
Mhm.
Right? Like, there's historic sites, there are recreation sites, there are, of course, the large national parks. So whenever I travel somewhere, I try to make sure I go to some of those less visited sites.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say Cabrillo National Monument is less visited because it's such a mild climate. We get actually more visitors than we do at Great Sand Dunes.
Really?
Yep,
Just because
yep.
people
So
can visit all year?
they can visit all year. That's right. So it's a small park in San Diego, California. So it's fairly close to the Mexico border. And this park was created to commemorate Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo. So he was the first European explorer sailing for the King of Spain to encounter what is now the coast of North America. And this
Mhm.
was in 1542. So this was 3 ships kinda making their way up past what's now Mexico and the United States, and peacefully interacting with the local tribal communities that lived there.
Wow.
So he was given guidance to not engage aggressively, that this was a exploration, a peaceful exploration. And he was really looking for a trade route. So that
Right.
was what the guidance was. And was as with many small National Park Service unit sites, Cabrillo National Monument is amazingly complex. So it's located at the end of a tall peninsula that is at the entrance to San Diego Bay, and
Mhm.
it really represents many eras. So there was, Cabrillo entered the harbor of what's now San Diego Bay in 1542, as I mentioned. But this land was used for many purposes, being at the entrance of the harbor. So there is a historic lighthouse there from the 1800s. World War One and Two military structures are on
Mhm.
the 160 acres of the park as well.
Wow.
There are, very rare coastal landscape habitats. So this is where inventory and monitoring comes in as well,
Mhm.
understanding how those change. And then there's some tide pools there as well. So there's access to rocky intertidal zones,
Hmm.
and there's a really great partnership there with volunteers. So a set of volunteers work on helping to protect those tide pools for when
Cool.
visitors come. And so as a result, it's a really high quality tide pool area, so it draws a lot of people to come to
Do
that.
people recreate in the tide pools?
So it's mostly exploring. So it's looking for creatures, so it's kind of
Oh,
it's as the tide goes, so during high tides is completely covered, and then
right.
as the tides go out, you have these little pools that are exposed. So it is
Okay.
people looking for animals and plants and watching birds and looking
Wow,
for
cool.
sea stars and
Yeah.
looking for brittle stars or octopus or
Wow.
uh, limpets,
Octopus.
right? So it's just an exploration,
Yeah,
really.
that's cool.
So yeah, it's pretty neat.
As we transition more into, we'll use the rest of our time to talk about Great Sand Dunes, because obviously that's where
Okay.
you're superintendent now. Something that I found really interesting, and I mentioned it in the intro, of how it's not only just the sand dunes, but there are such diverse ecosystems of wetlands, forests, alpine lakes, and tundra. Can you talk a little bit about the watershed? Because my understanding is this ties to a lot of it and its transition from alpine tundra to the wetlands.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, and you had mentioned I sometimes wish the park was called Great Sand Dunes and a whole lot more National Park and
Yeah.
Preserve, because the dunes make up only about 12% of the
Wow.
field. So it was named, the National Great Sand Dunes National Monument was created in 1932, and it did really
Hmm.
focus on the dune field. However, late in the 1990s, there was concern in the San Luis Valley and in the community about the potential for groundwater being exported and
Mm.
taken outside of the valley. Now, it is a dry climate here. It's about 11 inches of rain a year. All the agriculture is really focused on dry land, low water agricultural crops. So the citizens of the area approached the National Park Service about protecting an entire watershed.
Wow.
And
The
so
citizen, it was like spurred on by the citizens?
it was,
That's so
yes.
cool.
And that often happens with national parks is that it is driven by citizen initiatives. It's
Wow.
"Hey, we wanna protect this area, or we wanna protect this site." So that's a pretty that led to the creation of Great Sand Dunes National Park and Preserve, which are actually
Okay.
2 units in the
Hmm.
National Park Service. And it created it, so what it did is they wanted to protect an entire watershed.
Okay.
So it starts from the highest levels, so kind of the ridge line. So there are alpine tundra habitats up there. So this is all above tree level. So this is the picas I mentioned, the high alpine plants, bighorn sheep are up there. So this is kind of the range of about 14,000 feet to about
Yeah.
11,700 feet, kind of in that range.
Wow.
Then you hit what's called a crumholz, which I understand means twisted trees.
Okay.
So this is kind of trees at the upper limit of their habitat. So that's around a lot of limber and bristlecone pines. And
Hmm.
some of our alpine lakes are up there as well. And as you move down to lower elevation, you get into the subalpine forest. This is where you have more firs and pines, more wet meadows.
Yeah.
The aspen and Douglas firs start to show up. Move further downhill in elevation again, you hit what's called the montane foothills. This kind of really juniper trees, pinyon pine. So this is kind of around the visitor center area. That's
Yeah.
dominant species there. Of course, the dune field itself. And then as you continue to move out towards what was previously a huge lake in kind of prehistoric times,
Oh, okay.
now a dry lake bed, which is San Luis Valley, you get into what's called the sand sheet. So this is kind of extensive grasslands and shrublands that are surrounded by dunes. So now we're in the kind of 7,500 to 8,200 foot elevation,
Okay.
kind of cactus, cottonwood trees, grasses. The,
Wow.
the pronghorn show up. As you move out a little bit farther, we have a sabka, which is an Arabic word. And that's really where a wetland area where the groundwater moves up and down. So you
Okay.
tend to get these kind of white alkali deposits. And then, of course, you some of the wetland areas as well are also down in that area, about 7,500 feet. So that's actually a little
Wow.
bit below where like the visitor center is now. So visitor center is at about 8,200 feet. So quite a range from kind
That's
of the
crazy.
highest levels. It is. It is. So pretty amazing types of habitats
Yeah.
and pretty amazing opportunities if you have the time to do that and explore those.
Do people recreate and backpack through that whole range of elevation? And are there people who are like summiting the different mountains within the park?
They really are. Yeah. So there is people that do backcountry trips and backpacking trips and camping. They are people that go up to some of the highest level peaks. So what we're looking at there is over 13,000-foot peaks.
Hmm.
That is very technical climbing,
Oh,
right?
wow. Okay.
Yeah, there's not it takes significant route finding, there's not trails there, potentially exposure to cliffs and really steep areas. So you have to be very informed and well equipped if you
Right.
go kinda up those distances.
Right.
So, but there's also opportunities to hike, like, through some of those montane forest and go up to some of the subalpine lakes and to kinda see some of those.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. We were speaking before this started or before we started recording that I've gotten a chance to go to Great Sand Dunes very briefly before, but it was just to the sand dunes park portion of the park. And it was like we were stopping by on a road trip back from Colorado to Texas, and we got to sled and quote unquote snowboard or sandboard
Yeah. Yeah.
down the dunes. But the way you're talking about it, I'm like, I must return to
Yes.
go,
That's right.
see the sand dunes again as an adult, but then also get some exposure to some of the backpacking and backcountry trails.
Yeah, yeah. There's some really amazing places. I would say, there's I mentioned it's 2 different units, and when, of course, any big actions like this, you go out to the public, right? And you say so when they were going from national monument status and moving into kind of those other 2 categories,
Yeah.
one of the things that came back is the area that's the preserve used to be US Forest Service lands. And so
Oh,
people
interesting.
people wanted to be able to continue to hunt, to fish, to trap. I don't think there's much trapping happening now, but they wanted to be able to continue those activities even with the creation of a National Park Service unit. So
Yeah.
that was how the creation of the preserve
Yeah.
allows for those things. So slightly
Yeah.
different management approaches in the national park, which is more to the west, and the
Okay.
preserve that is really the mountains that go up to the edge of the ridgeline.
Wow, very cool. The next two things I'm curious about many things, but where I'm going to, direct our conversation towards is with regards to native fish and then bison recovery. So, can you share a little bit more about the restoration of native fish? And really quickly, the reason I ask this is because Glacier has been doing some really cool stuff with restoring native fish that I
Oh,
learned
yeah.
about. And I learned about this whole world of like native fish restoration. So, I was really curious to hear what Great Sand Dunes is doing.
Oh, yes, and this is one of the partnerships that I think is worth celebrating as well. So I'm really glad you asked about fish. As a ecologist, biologist, I like those efforts
Mhm,
towards making the ecosystem stronger, right? You're
mhm,
rebuilding the pieces of the ecosystem. And this is one of those projects. And there's 3 species particularly that the staff are working on restoration of native
'kay.
fishes. And the partnership ship comes in because we are working with Colorado Parks and Wildlife.
Oh, wow.
They have a native fish hatchery in San Luis Valley. And so there are
Okay,
3 species that we're working with for that. So one is the Rio Grande cutthroat trout, and this is
okay,
the most probably the most interest to anglers and to fishermen. So this is in the past, non-native species were added, right, mostly for game fish and things like this.
mhm,
So that we're in the process of removing those non-native fish and then going to be putting in so in some of those stream reaches and the Rio Grande cutthroat trout have already been replaced. So they are now, as of a couple years ago, the dominant major fish in some of those
nice.
streams. And now we're working on the lower level streams as well to do the same thing, so
Okay,
to rebuild that. And so one of the reasons is Rio Grande cutthroat trout are rare species. So the parks have a special opportunity to be able to add and contribute to populations regionally to be able to
right.
kind of assist with that.
Yeah.
And eventually, we do wanna open that up again to anglers to do catch and release. So
Oh,
this
cool.
would be a pretty unique opportunity where anglers it can be one of the cutthroat trout species,
Yeah.
that they can look for and that they can
Wow, cool. And
so
what's the
that's
difference
fun.
between an angler and a fisherman? Is it the same?
Okay. I think they're the same, yes.
Okay,
So
we may get
I don't
yeah, if you're listening to this and you know the difference and there is a big difference, let us know. But as of
yes.
right now, we're saying they're the same.
Yeah, I'd like to learn that too, if there's a difference
Yeah,
between
yeah, I'll funnel it back to you.
Okay, great. That works. And then the other 2 species are not as important to fishermen, but are a important part of the ecosystem as well. And
Right.
this is the Rio Grande chub and the Rio Grande sucker. And
Okay.
these are especially in habitats out in that kind of flat area that I mentioned, kind of the west
Yeah.
part of the park now. And that's again working with Colorado Parks and Wildlife and also our neighbor, the US Fish and Wildlife Service.
Right.
The Baca Refuge is immediately north of us. And so we do a
Cool.
lot of collaborative efforts. And
Yeah, that's
so one
amazing.
is with the restoration of this fish. And that was pretty fun. I actually went out and helped to release some of the fish hatcheries one day. So that was pretty fun. So we had
Fun day
buckets.
on the job. Oh my gosh.
Like I'm sorry that the field work is kind of rare for a superintendent.
Yeah, that's what I've
Uh,
gleaned from interviewing superintendents. So it
yeah,
sounds more exciting when you get the opportunity to do that.
to do those kind of things, yeah.
Yeah.
And so just kind of gently dumped a bucket of fish into the
So
water.
cute.
It was, and it was watching their reactions, like, some of the fish kinda darted all around, and some of them just kinda sat there, and I asked the CPW biologist about it, and he said, "The fish have not been in strong currents before." So this is a
Whoa.
new experience, so they're trying to figure out okay, what is this? What is
So
this?
interesting.
Yeah,
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 I wouldn't have thought of
so
that. How
yeah,
fascinating.
yeah,
I guess what about the bison recovery? So for folks, the Great Sand
yes.
Dunes was selected for bison recovery. And so I'm
That
curious kind of what that
yeah.
means and what that entails for you, your park.
Yes, this is a very exciting opportunity as well. So, at the national level, the American bison or American buffalo have been identified for restoring populations. And
Okay.
this is across many parks and many agencies. So, it includes National Park Service, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Bureau of Land Management,
Yeah.
U.S. Geological Survey, and Bureau of Indian Affairs because
Mm,
our tribal partners are an important part of this. So
right.
there was a bison conservation initiative in 2008. And then more recently, there was a Department of Interior Secretary Order 3410, March
Hmm.
of 23. And these kind of direct bison recovery. And this is where Great Sand Dunes was identified.
Cool.
Um, slightly before that, the park had put together an ungulate management plan, and this was published in 2019. And this includes adding wild bison onto the natural landscape. So making that ecosystem whole, right? You're
Hmm.
adding them back in when they were previously hunted out. And we're looking at kind of across the park. This ungulate management plan described it very generally.
Yeah.
We would be working again with the Baca Refuge, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So looking at those two landscapes together, and and we're really early on, right? What do we need to do next is to put together an implementation and co-stewardship plan.
Mm,
So what does that look like? How do we work with our other agencies and most specifically working with our tribes? So this
yeah.
is co-stewardship. We want to work with our 29 affiliated tribes, as many as who are interested in working together with us on bison management.
Yeah.
And we did some ethnographic studies a few years ago, and even then, a lot of the tribes said, "Yes, we wanna work with you. We think that
Cool.
bison are important on this landscape." So
Where within the landscape, because we talked about it goes from wet or like tundra to wetlands, where do we think or where historically have bison been?
so historically, out a lot out on the western part of the park, so on that
Eh,
kind of lowest wetland not wetland, but grassland area,
oh,
that's
right. That makes sense.
dunes, the San Luis Valley, kinda that flatter area. Although
Okay.
it is a big question, right?
Yeah, like where will they go?
Where will they go? Certainly if you visit Yellowstone and they would be a part we'd be working with them, right? We probably might get some of the Yellowstone bison.
Oh,
Source has not
interesting.
been determined yet. Certainly, we're looking at a smaller population, releasing a few animals at first, and then the genetic link with other populations is because you are moving animals between populations. So
Right.
we're looking at other national park sites, other refuge sites, moving animals between that to
Right.
make strength genetically.
That's cool.
So yeah,
Yeah.
and
Lots of components to think about. I'm thinking, like you said, figuring out the source, figuring out, and I guess part of what you'll figure out over time is where they end up going. Like you can predict they'll go somewhere, but where the herds end up actually being is
that's right.
another thing.
That's right, exactly. We'll be very curious to see, like, do they move through we know at Yellowstone, they move through forested areas, so
Yeah.
might they go up into the preserve? There's not much food for them on the dunes,
Yeah.
uh, but they might go up the edges of it. We certainly see elk and deer on going up partway up into the hillside of the dunes, so,
Interesting. Yeah.
yeah,
Only time will tell, I guess.
it will. Yeah, exactly.
As we wrap up our time, I'd love to understand, and this is a question I ask all superintendents, but what's something you wish everyone knew about Great Sand Dunes, regardless if they have or haven't been? And what's a common misconception or myth that you'd like to debunk?
Okay, I kind of alluded to this earlier. But the park and the preserve are not just a big pile of sand.
That
It
was my guess is what you're gonna say because I was like, I feel like that's what I learned in researching the park and in us
yeah,
talking.
yeah. It is so much more. So
Yeah.
that would be my really visit is to for people is to come visit, see the diversity, and just be stunned at that
Yeah.
difference.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you so much. It was so fun to chat and dig into different subsets of questions. I really appreciate your time and guess I'm jonesing to get out to Sand Dunes National Park and Preserve.
All right, that sounds great. Thank you so much, Maddie. It's been,
Yeah, of course.
I've enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thanks so much for listening today. Our music was composed by Danielle Bees. If you liked this podcast, rate, review, download, and tell your friends about it. This ensures the stories of our national parks and how they are run are shared. Listen to the other episodes wherever you listen to your podcasts or visit us at whorunthispark.com to learn more. I'm Maddie Pellman, and you've been listening to Who Runs This Park.